Well, good afternoon from a very warm New York City. My name is Bob Linden, and I would like to welcome each of you to today's webinar, which is entitled Don't Leave Money on the Table, Negotiating Client Contracts from a Position of Strength. Negotiating an agreement that benefits both the agency and your client isn't as hard as it sounds, but you have to understand the business issues behind the legal language and come to the table with a clear idea of which issues matter most to you and why. Today's webinar leaders, Jody Sutter and Sharon Toerek, will discuss how to have an unemotional, productive conversation throughout the new business process to arrive at a mutually beneficial agreement. Before we start, some housekeeping. You can hear us, but we cannot hear you. If you have any problems viewing the presentation on your computer, it could be a firewall or security issue on your end, and you may need to contact your IT person. If you need to contact us via an email, please send an email to webclinics@filamentinc.com. We'll help you if you have any technical issues. And if you disconnect for any reason, just go back to the email invitation and log in again. Our webinar leaders today are Jody Sutter and Sharon Toerek. Jody Sutter is owner of the Sutter Company, a consultancy that provides new business tools, training, and coaching to advertising agencies and marketing services firms. Sharon Toerek is principal of Toerek Law, where she focuses her national law practice on helping professionals in the advertising, marketing, and creative services industries to protect and monetize their intellectual capital and manage the legal implications of their marketing and advertising work. At the end of the web clinic, we'll have a few minutes for questions. However, please feel free to send us your questions as we go through the webinar. You could send us your questions via the Q&A box, which should be on your computer, or you can email us your questions at webclinics@filamentinc.com. We encourage everyone to tweet during this webinar using the hashtag FilamentWebClinics. We will be sending all attendees a PDF of today's presentation. And now, please welcome Jody Sutter and Sharon Toerek.
Thanks, Bob.
Hey there, everyone. Thank you, Bob.
Well, welcome, everybody. We're excited to be here with you today to talk about creating stronger, more solid contracts and how to give you some tools and tactics during your negotiation process to come out the other side of new business with a deal that makes good sense for you and protects your agency. You'll see up on your screen today sort of a lay of the land of what we'll be covering today, which basically falls into one of three categories. The first being the typical mistakes that Jody sees in her new business counseling work and that I see in my legal work. Agencies make when they're in the new business process, whether it's a pitch or responding to a proposal. Some tips about how to avoid those mistakes to make deals that are better for the agency and that result in stronger contracts to protect your interests. And then we'll talk briefly about tools and information that you need to be more effective at client contract negotiation. But first we'll start with Jody, and to give us some great context based on her experience helping agencies in this area with contract negotiation.
Yeah, and before I get to the story, one of the things as we were starting to think about the content for this webinar, I was thinking a lot about how we as ad agency executives and specifically ad agency new business people, we have a reputation for saying yes to prospective clients, especially when we're anxious to win them over. So in order to show that our agency is gung-ho and easy to do business with, we've said yes to spake work, to late hours, unreasonable deadlines, among so many other things. And that's why I think for some of us, negotiating contracts with new clients is a kind of a terrifying prospect, because it usually requires us to push back. And what if that makes the client not like us so much? So look, we're in the services business, and I put equal weight on both of those terms. You have a responsibility to your agency to set up a mutually rewarding relationship with a new client from the first moments of the pitch. Now, I overcame my fear of negotiating some years ago while I was doing business development for RGA. At the time, our prospect was a major global financial services giant, and it was building its headquarters in a prominent Midtown Manhattan location. I was pitching for a contract to do an elaborate set of interactive displays that were going to be in the lobby. The lobby was going to be open to the public, was going to get a lot of traffic. It was a very high-profile project. It was big and important for the agency, and it was big and important for me personally and professionally. So, no pressure. Now, the guy on the other side of the negotiating table from me was a project manager at Skanska. And I don't know if that's going to be a familiar name to some of you or not, but Skanska is one of the world's largest global construction companies. They were in charge of building this major Midtown Manhattan headquarters. So he was in a different business from me. He was older than me. He was more experienced than me. And he was probably more accustomed to negotiating with Teamsters than with a young, up-and-coming, enthusiastic business development exec at an upcoming digital ad agency. So he was intimidating for sure. And I was as unnerved by him as I was of the legal language that I had to unravel. And you can only imagine that combination of global construction company, financial services firm, put that together, and you've got one dense legal document. But my negotiating partner, he turned out to be an unlikely mentor. I was struck by the way that he was so unafraid to break down every clause into understandable human language. And he taught me some important lessons. First of all, he taught me that everything is negotiable. Just because it's written in important sounding language doesn't mean it should be in the contract. Everything is negotiable. The second thing I learned, thanks to watching how he broke down all those dense legal terms into ideas that became easy for me to grasp, I learned that in those dense terms, they are just fancy ways of describing business issues that were actually quite familiar to me. And finally, once I understood what those business issues were, I was then able to get very clear about which issues were important to me. And then it made it much easier to ask for what I wanted or what I knew my agency wanted, and potentially to walk away if we didn't get it. Now, my unlikely mentor also made me a more valuable business development person because I could then close a deal while also negotiating with the best interests of my employer in mind. Now, in my experience, the idea of negotiating with the agency's best interest in mind makes some agency executives queasy. It's like standing up for themselves is rocking the boat. So again, as I said at the beginning, we tend to go to dangerous extremes, or we can go to dangerous extremes to please a prospective client. But being a good sport today can lead to regrets in the future.
Yeah, and I would add to that. I think one of the things that story illuminates, and I'm sure everybody on the line already realizes that, but I'll emphasize the point that sometimes the legalese and the lawyers that get involved in the process can make this more challenging for agencies because you don't really have a way of knowing when you're looking at the legalese necessarily how to weigh the terms. But when you try to reduce them down to your business issues, they become easier to prioritize. And you figure out better where to push back and how to manage your time and resources to get to a deal for everybody. You won't necessarily know looking at a master services agreement whether one clause might be more important to you than another, just on the weight of it. I mean, on the face of it all the time. But I think taking the time to equate the legal language to familiar business issues helps everybody get down to a middle point that's more acceptable more quickly. So again, as I indicated to you earlier on, Jody and I have talked a lot about this, and we've really kind of whittled this down to 6 of the most common mistakes that we see agencies make during the new business process. And I would say it's not just during a pitch, but whether you're doing a proposal or a pitch, or whether you use inbound strategies to get clients to come to you. These are universal, and we're going to talk through them briefly. And I think Jody is going to go through the first part of this list.
So we're going to talk about the NDA at the beginning of a pitch or an account review, and why it's important, and sometimes why we maybe don't see it as important as we should. We're also going to talk about the tendency to give away work for free during a pitch or when we're requested to give away work for free and how we can manage that. The third thing that we're going to talk about is defining scope and compensation, what happens when you define it poorly and how to maybe define it more articulately and tangibly.
Next, we'll talk about starting the work without having a contract signed already. And this may seem like a blinding flash of the obvious to all of you, but I'd put good money on the fact that almost everybody on the line has started a project or two during the life of their agencies without having everything buttoned down. So we're going to talk about some strategies to maybe get you to signing faster so that this doesn't occur. The inability to show work to future prospects. This is something that in legal parlance you might refer to as a portfolio right or display right. But we're going to talk about ways to address this in the beginning of the relationship. And then finally, what we see frequently is that agencies get hung up not only by the legalese, but also because they don't have a consistent process or a consistent set of legal tools within their agencies to help them document new business and new relationships. And we've seen patterns of this causing deals to take a lot longer to close or to make agencies a little more reluctant to button things up. So those are the issues that we'll talk about, the common mistakes we see agencies make, and then we'll get to some solutions later on in the presentation.
So mistake number one, no NDA at the beginning of a pitch or an account review. I'm going to describe a scenario that may sound familiar. The prospect of your dreams has just called or sent you an email and they want you to pitch their business. But they're moving fast, and before they can send you the brief, you must sign their NDA right away, which also happens to be complicated and mostly irrelevant to the business of advertising. So what do? Now, for some, the temptation is to plow ahead, not to question the irrelevant clauses, or even worse, decide that deciphering the complicated language is going to be too time-consuming because, of course, you don't want to keep the client waiting. You want to keep them happy. You want to show that you're easy to do business with. But what you end up doing is you end up seeing overly burdensome language around things like ownership of ideas, or even things like unnecessary levels of insurance. So you might see a very high level of insurance required from companies that might outsource their manufacturing. So this is a situation where an NDA, they have a general purpose NDA, whether you are an advertising agency or a manufacturing or a factory, right? Now, if you're a factory, these levels of insurance make a lot of sense because there can be some really serious liability issues here. But if you're an advertising agency, they're really irrelevant to what you do. So non-disclosure agreements are very important, and they don't have to be complicated or long, and they should always be mutual. And Sharon's going to talk a little bit more about the nature of those agreements and how to make them work for you.
Right. I think that further to what Jody said, part of the new business challenge for agencies in general, especially if you work with a legacy brand, is that the temptation is to work by default with the forms and documents that the prospect presents to you. And many times they're going to look like they're somewhat generic, and they're not taking into account the special kind of value you're going to be bringing to the relationship or the special nature of the work you're going to be doing. So that's one of the reasons why I think it's tempting for agencies simply to sign the NDA. I also think agencies undervalue the amount of intellectual property that gets created during the new business process, and the lack of buttoning up can put the agency in jeopardy of having that IP taken or used by the brand. And it's totally legal for the brand to do this if there's not an NDA in place or you don't have some other preventative measures in place. And getting those ideas, those concepts fleshed out or executed by a competing agency or perhaps by the brand's internal shop or marketing department. So these are specific issues very particular to your industry and your business that makes the NDA really important. You're giving them business strategy suggestions or things that can help them take their company to the next level. And you want to make sure ownership and use of those materials is clearly defined, and a non-disclosure agreement is one way to do that. Here's another reason why you should never hesitate on the issue of a non-disclosure agreement from a legal perspective. And I'm not naive. I know that we'll get off the webinar today and many of you will decide that a NDA just doesn't fit your culture, or you're not comfortable asking for them, or you don't feel like it's important. And I would urge you to sort of suspend that type of thinking, at least briefly, and look at it from this perspective. Just about every single brand that you might pursue as a potential client will be without hesitation in its request that you sign its mutual non-disclosure agreement before you start talking about the work. If that happens, there's a really, really good chance that that proposed non-disclosure agreement will not be mutual. And what I mean by that is it will protect the client's interests up and down. And naturally, you're going to respect the confidentiality of the information that they share with you, whether or not you sign an NDA. But it'll protect their interests. It also might overreach into areas like owning the suggestions, the ideation, the concepts that you create during the conversations that you have. And we'll talk separately about protecting pre-pitch IP. But they won't hesitate to ask you to sign an agreement, and then there's a high chance that it's not going to be mutual. Secondly, I think it really creates a more level playing field between agency and brand when you present early in the conversation with the sophistication of asking about non-disclosure, and you present it in the spirit of mutuality. Your desire to make sure the client's information is buttoned up, and your expectation that they'll desire to do the same for your information.
You know, I also think that there's a lot of things you can learn about your client this early on in the process. And if they prove to be really unwilling to do some of the things that Sharon is suggesting that you do, I think it sends up red flags. You know, it's like how they're behaving now is only going to be magnified by how they behave if you do get to work with them.
Right. I think that's so true. And I think that another good reason to not be shy about this issue is that it's much easier to benchmark what the prospective client's agreements and legal forms might mean for you, or how they look, if you have your own versions of these documents. So having your own non-disclosure agreement in place, asking that it get signed as a matter of course, are important. But even if you're not going to do that, it's important to at least have your own version of a mutual non-disclosure. If nothing else, it's going to help you benchmark when you've got to review one that the brand presents to you, especially if the brand is insisting you use their forms. Mistake number 2, you give away work for free during the pitch or the proposal or the chemistry meeting.
Yeah, so in my experience at least, agencies hate the idea of doing work for free during a pitch. And yet they can't help themselves. So that's a much bigger problem that we are not going to be solving today during this webinar. We'll have to save that for another day, a whole other web clinic. I'll be talking to Bob about this after that. So yeah, we'll have to await the day when a critical mass of us brave ad agencies get together and says no to spec work, and that'll open up the door for the rest of us to follow. So in the meantime, what we can do is we can deal with spec work by managing some expectations of the clients up front, and also being very clear with ourselves about when it's going to be worthwhile doing that spec work, what the risks and rewards are. And this is where a very tightly defined set of selection criteria can be very helpful. So I often approach the decision about whether to pitch or not to pitch, whether it's been in the past with the agencies that I've worked for as a full-time employee, or when I'm helping my clients make the assessment now. I look at it in the same way, or get them to look at it in the same way I would if I were like I'm investing my money. So like investing, pitching is risky. Each pitch has its own risk to reward ratio. And by the way, that ratio should always be determined based on how your agency wants to grow, what your growth goals are. So potential rewards, like working with a prestigious client or a boatload of revenue, that might offset the risk of investing in doing spec work. You have to determine that. And again, why is spec work risky? Because you're going to be investing time, which is equal to money, resources equal to money, into doing something that may not be successful. Now, sometimes you're able to negotiate a modest fee for your pitched ideas up front. And again, I'm going to guess that probably most of you have been in that situation. And what you found is that it's not enough money to cover all your costs, but it does defray some expenses. And it's also in some ways in the opposite way that a really bad or non-mutual NDA can throw up red flags about a bad client. The willingness to pay something often indicates a client that's also willing to be a real partner with you. Now, this might be worth it to you, and it might not be worth it to you. You go back to your selection criteria, risk-reward ratio, and then Sharon also has some things to think about when it comes to being paid for your spec work as well.
Right. Yeah, and I think that even, I think the pendulum, I think Jody's completely correct that agencies sort of decry the fact that brands in some cases expect a lot of ideation. I think the pendulum has swung a little bit back towards the center in favor of agencies. In terms of actual spec assets and things like that, it still happens though. But what hasn't changed is the expectation that ideation or concepts be shared during the pre-engagement phase of the conversations. And I would just add to what Jody said by saying that it's very clear to decide after you've gone through your selection criteria, if you've made the decision based on those that you're going to take the risk and share some of your intellectual capital and make that investment. I think you should go into it with open eyes. And I am fully comfortable with our agency clients deciding to give away some of their work, including the intellectual property rights to that work, as long as it's their decision and they're making it knowingly. And so to that end, I would just say to you, be very clear in the pre-engagement phase of the relationship about what you're giving up. And if you haven't decided to execute a non-disclosure agreement, I have another suggestion or two in a moment about how to address that. Decide what you're giving up, what you're not willing to give up, and be clear about what you're retaining. You may very well have pre-existing assets or concepts that you've suggested to other potential clients in the past, and you want to hold on to them if the new prospect doesn't bite on them. You may have a significant amount of intellectual capital that comes from you working in a product category or a vertical frequently. That's your industry knowledge or intellectual capital. You're certainly not going to be comfortable, or you shouldn't be anyway, transferring that IP to a prospective client. The point is be clear. Be clear about what you're giving up. Be clear about what you're keeping. And if you are going to negotiate some rights to the pitch materials, be clear in the agreement that sets forth the compensation for that stuff, what you're keeping and what you're letting the client keep. One potential solution for those of you who still run screaming from the non-disclosure agreement, use your assets that get created. This only works if you actually create some tangible assets for the business development phase of your relationship. But if you're creating things like storyboards, sample wireframes, video screenshots, whatever they might be, make sure you're putting intellectual property ownership legends and language on all those sample assets. You should also have a standard intellectual property ownership clause that you plug into all of your written proposals, because a lot of times the secret sauce gets disclosed in the written proposal itself or response to RFQ or RFP. Yeah. So make sure you have the habit of putting IP ownership language in those sample assets and in those proposal documents as well.
And that's just as simple as having that paragraph on the requisite page within your proposal template. And by the way, you should have a proposal template that you work with all the time too. Again, probably
Yeah.
fodder for another web clinic.
Absolutely. And we talked a little bit about negotiating fees in advance, and just make sure you document those negotiations in writing, so that I'll just remind everybody that when it comes to intellectual property and the creative services field or the marketing services field, we're usually talking about copyright. And copyright only transfers under U.S. law in writing. So you've got to have some sort of writing that dictates who gets and keeps what. And you're going to want to have it anyway to indicate the issue of compensation. So let's talk about how we define work scope, and the fact that in many cases the mistake you might be making is not defining the scope or the compensation well enough.
And taking a step back, I tie this back to another perennial struggle that I see ad agencies going through, and that is the constant struggle to find concrete terms to describe their scope of services. And here's my theory behind why that is. It's because what you do is largely intangible. Your value is derived from your ideas. Now, you might harness those ideas through some kind of a work process or work methodology, and that's going to help bring those ideas to life, or at least help them, give them a little bit more of a texture. But even those methodologies and those work processes are intangible as well. So you've got intangible ideas coming up with those intangible ideas in intangible work processes. So everything's really, really abstract. Now, the more tangible something is, the easier it is to communicate its value. So we understand, for instance, what we want to pay for, I don't know, a doorknob or a jar of peanut butter, or even a service like getting your hair cut. It's easier to articulate the value to us. If we really like peanut butter, we might be willing to pay more for the last jar on the shelf. If we don't really care about our personal appearance, then a haircut is not that valuable to us. On the other hand, the more abstract or unfamiliar a product or a service is, the harder it is to convincingly convey its value. Now, what I find is with advertising agencies that attempts are made, often using jargon or generalizations or overblown and unnecessary adjectives. It's when you start to see things described as like a rigorous process, or a team that is in relentless pursuit of results. It feels like if you're writing these phrases, it feels like you're writing something substantial, and it may even be true, but it does not communicate anything tangible or substantial to the client or the prospect, and they find it very difficult to then equate that to a certain amount of value. Now, a lot of what I do with my clients is to help them translate their intangible services into tangible ideas, which lead to make it much easier to make them valued. And this is very useful when it comes time to tell the client what you're going to be doing in exchange for their money. And Sharon's going to give you a few hints.
Yeah, and I think it's very important to package in your proposal documents the compensation and the elements of the compensation to the stages of the work. There are some specific things you want to make sure get mentioned in your contract, so that you don't find yourself in a situation of being out of scope and not knowing how to handle the issue of adjusting the compensation so that your margins stay healthy for working on a project. The first thing is referring briefly, I'm just going to back up one second. We've got steps and stages represented in this slide, and I've just quickly stop back here again to remind you all that if you are milestoning your compensation to specific stages of the work, make sure you say that in the agreement. I've seen lots of really well-written, elegant proposals that sort of talk about how the work's going to flow, and then there might be just a quick little grid at the end about how much money is due when, without necessarily tying the two to each other. So if you're going to perform the project or the engagement in different phases, and each one has got some compensation element assigned to it, be clear about that and make sure that they appear together so that it's easy to tie the two. In addition to that, I frequently see this with creative shops in particular, or more design-focused shops, that there may be a need to set an expectation up front about the number of rounds or revisions or changes the agency might be willing to do to a piece of executed work before you go out of scope and have to, and I apologize for the horn in the background. We seem to have an ambulance going by, so sorry about that.
As long as it's not you.
No, it's all about it's all part of live webinar giving, right? You want to make sure that you are being specific. And, there's a number of ways you can do this. I've got agencies that will say, we will do no more than 2 rounds of revisions. I love that as a lawyer because it's very specific. There's really no room for interpretation. But if you're not willing to limit it to a number, at least use language of reasonableness or necessity, things like that, so that the client understands that you're only going to limit the number of revisions or changes to what makes sense for the particular deliverable. And then indicate what happens if you go out of the scope, and when something akin to a change order or an additional statement of work is going to need to be prepared. Another tip, I find in too many cases, I see agencies get stuck about having to end up feeling like order takers in terms of timing and rush assignments that weren't originally contemplated, or despite everybody's best intentions and the client swearing up and down at the beginning about their philosophy about turnaround and things like that. Deadlines get compressed for whatever reasons. So be clear about what your rush work policies are. Especially if you're flat feeing or project feeing this work, if you need to charge a premium to keep your team members available to deal with rush situations, or to keep your margins in check because you've got to reallocate resources to deal with a rush situation, make sure your contract gives you room to charge those rush fees or those premium rates to clients. And similarly, if you're relying on any third-party resources to create the deliverables, freelancers, production shops, you need to give yourself space in the agreement to pass on those rush fees, those premium increases that they may charge to you onto the client. So it's very popular now to talk about value pricing, value compensation, results-based compensation models. I'm not personally seeing a lot of evidence that agencies and clients are doing a great job coming to an agreement about what this always means, but some are doing a great job defining value compensation, and it's not always based on things like success fees. Sometimes it's reflected in things like flat fees that incorporate a much higher blended hourly rate than you might otherwise be able to realize. You all are much more creative than probably any lawyer is at figuring out how to best blend your compensation so that it incentivizes you to do a better job for your client based on the results that you achieve. The point I just want to stress here is that from a legal perspective, if you are going to base any part of your compensation for a client engagement on metrics of performance, achievement, whether it's a sales target, a lead target, an increase in profitability, whatever that might be, the more specific the target, the longer the attention span needs to be to make sure you're crafting an explanation of what those targets are, when you'll measure them, and what the client is expected to pay for achieving them. So if this is an element of your compensation that really helps you achieve better profitability, or it's particularly attractive to a particular group of clients or industries, spend some time thinking about how you're going to define these metrics in a way that makes sense in your contracts. And then this is more a more basic suggestion, which is how are you billing? When you say retainer to a client, what do you really mean by a retainer? Do you mean a pre-purchase of hourly billings by paying a flat fee every month that's going to be charged off against your hourly rates. And if you do, that's fine, but make sure it's clear in the agreement, and make sure you're clear about how and when you're going to account for that. And make sure you're not jamming yourself up by having the client not use a lot of its time while it's paying you the retainer and then expecting you to be available on a double time basis later in the year. Are you charging a simple project fee? If you are, what's going to be included in that fee and what is over and above? We talked about performance or target-based compensation. And in many cases, agencies blend different kinds of compensation for one client. So you may be doing, you may be charging a retainer that covers only a discrete group of services or deliverables, and anything outside that is separately quoted. If you do that, just make sure the documentation makes clear what's included and what is going to be subject to an additional statement of work and fee expectation. And I think we talked sufficiently about premiums based either on rush work, on particular kinds of projects. The only other thing I would add here is that some agencies are, I'm seeing this more recently in contracts, they're clarifying the differential in rates based on who in the agency is participating in the client deliverables. Very high level strategy advice and consultation that might come from the C-suite within an agency is being billed at a specific and very high rate. The general creative services and work might be billed at the agency's prevailing rates, etc. Account management, administrative services, etc. So if you're charging any premiums for specific kinds of services or for the involvement of specific professionals in your agency, you want to make sure you're clear about that in your contract as well. Starting without a signed contract, and I can hear the mental eye rolls all the way here in Cleveland, Ohio. Most of you are thinking to yourself, you know, we know it's dumb to start without a signed contract, yet some of you are still doing it. And so Jody and I felt very strongly like it was important for us to talk about the motivations for doing this, and sort of are sharing your pain here, because we do understand why this happens, and sharing some ideas about how to get past that and some practical tips from a legal perspective.
Yeah, you know, starting without a signed contract to me makes doing spec work look like the most sensible thing in the whole wide world. But so I'm also going to start this one by highlighting it from a business issue, or highlighting as a business issue that, again, I think many agencies struggle with. And that is the difficulty, whether it's actual or perceived or emotional, of committing to a niche. Again, another topic for a whole other webinar. So there are a lot of agencies out there who are full service, who find it hard to resist the temptation not to be all things to all people. There's that sense that, well, why would I want to eliminate a potential client? The world is, you know, the world is my client base. So here's one of the reasons why you may not want to do that. If an agency can't differentiate itself through competitive positioning, it has to rely more on subjective factors that are much harder to control. And those subjective factors are things like whether the prospect is going to like your spec work. You know, this is also, I think Sharon sort of alluded to it earlier, but this is often where I advise, if you've got to do spec work, try to limit it to strategies or concepts. Once someone sees, human beings we got a lot of flaws. Once we see colors and shapes and images in front of our eyes, it's so much easier to decide, make a quick judgment, I like it or I don't like it. Ideas and concepts it's easier to sell that through to a larger group of disparate people. So you lose a lot of control when you show spec work. The other thing that agencies who find it hard to differentiate themselves through a specialty or a niche, they then find themselves relying a lot on good chemistry between themselves and the prospective client. Now, chemistry is very important. Showing that you are likable and easy to do business with can definitely win you pitches. However, typically that sense of that good chemistry, that likability, is going to win you the pitch. It's going to be the point of difference when all other aspects of the playing field are level. So it's a little dangerous. So if you're relying on yourself, if you're relying on being likable, if you're relying on the good chemistry of the team, it makes saying no to starting work without a signed contract very hard, even if it's going to mean potentially disastrous outcomes for you in the future. This is probably the most important point to take away from this entire presentation. And here it is. You will never be in a stronger position than at the point when the prospect has agreed to hire you. The moment you do work for that prospect without a signed contract, you go from the position of greatest strength to a position of greatest weakness. The fall is quick and absolute. So what I advise my agencies is this: get out of your own head for a minute and think a little bit about the prospect situation. And I think that's actually a really good rule in general for a pitch. We like to bemoan the amount of work that these pitches take for our agency. And maybe it's going to be more work for us than it is for the client, but you know what? It's a lot of work on the client side. They're adding to their day jobs as well. So depending on the length of this pitch that you've just gone through, they've made a big investment in time, they've made a big investment in their resources, and they've probably even made a big emotional investment, because it is hard to choose one agency over several other finalists. So given the investment in time, resources, and emotion, what is the likelihood that they are going to walk away from that investment because you won't start work with a signed contract? The other thing too that sometimes happens, and it's funny, I was thinking about this as this webinar started, is that when you are at this point, sometimes the person that you're dealing with on the other side of the negotiating table is not actually the person who is making these decisions. So you might be talking to a brand manager or a advertising manager or a director of marketing, when the person who is the gatekeeper of these terms is someone in the C-suite, CFO, maybe the CEO, or the director of procurement, or maybe the in-house counsel. So you may put your client in a very uncomfortable position because they can't do anything about it. But you know what? If you start work without that signed contract, it means you lose them as leverage. If you don't start work without the signed contract, then you force them into a position to be your advocate internally and help you communicate some of the issues that you have and sort of force that through. Then you also have to think too about what the likelihood is that if you do start work without a signed contract, what's the likelihood that you're going to be able to recoup costs, protect your intellectual property, or prevent poaching from valuable employees? Those are just a few things that could happen. So get that contract signed.
Well, obviously the lawyer in the room highly seconds that emotion, but I also reckon I'm practical about working with agencies, and so I understand that this is not sexy stuff, and it's also not the reason any of you went into the agency business. And so the goal here today is to give you some ways to get through this more friction-free. And as Jody indicated, you're strong. You have your most leverage at the beginning. An additional thing to think about is that not only do you have the most leverage at the beginning of the engagement, but you need a contract as a roadmap to determine what are your worst case scenarios if the engagement doesn't go well. What if it's not a good fit ultimately? What if they're a nightmare client? What if they, for whatever reason, have decided that they need to part ways with you? And a lot of times these things happen for business reasons, having nothing to do with the quality of the work or the quality of the relationship. But you need to know what's the downside in terms of compensation, in terms of work rights, in terms of restrictive covenants. And the contract is your roadmap for determining what happens in any of those scenarios. So that in and of itself is a great reason to make sure you never start without something signed. And I'd also indicate that there are some remedies that are not going to be available to you later if you don't have a signed contract. Think about things like recovering your collection costs or your attorney fee shifting if you need to engage legal counsel to pursue a breached contract, things like the ability to charge interest or late fees on late payments. These are all contractual issues that require writings in every state in the U.S. And so if you don't include these in a written agreement, these are options you will not have available to you later. So in addition to the general understandings that will be included in the contract, these are special, really pocketbook provisions that will hurt your checkbook if they haven't been included up front in the agreement. So I think you get where we're coming from on this, and we want you to know that we get where you're coming from, and we have a lot of empathy for why it happens that you might start the work without the agreement in place, but we're hoping that all of you change your mind about that if that's how you currently do business.
Yeah.
So let's talk about portfolio rights and the ability to show samples of your work or to list a client brand on your roster, and how that might impact you as you do additional prospecting for clients.
Yeah, I think there's probably also a situation that most of you have run up against is a client who says, oh, by the way, you can't show the work in certain places. Maybe they restrict showing the work on the website, but you can show it in meetings. Some clients are so restrictive you can't even mention their names. And it never ceases to be ironic to me that clients deny these portfolio rights, because these very same clients would never have hired you had they not seen examples of work that you had done for other clients. So again, this is where you could take full advantage of your position of strength to secure the ability to publicly showcase your work that you're going to do for that client in the future. Now, it can be hard when a heavyweight like a Disney or a Walmart, and in my experience, those are two clients that I know have very stringent rules, or notorious for taking this hard line. When a Disney or a Walmart says no, that's when you have to go back to your selection criteria as a leader, as a leadership team, and determine if the potential rewards of this project or assignment or client are going to offset the risks or losses. So for instance, if a big reason for pitching this piece of business was to use it as a jumping off point to get more business in that category, then if that client is going to prevent you from showing the work, maybe the client is not as valuable to you as you thought it might be, and you have a walkaway position. Here's a way to present your case, and I've used this successfully in the past. You have to realize this, and the client has to realize this too, but realize this, that before hiring you, your clients want to make sure that your business is a healthy one. And that's why, if you think about it, that's why they ask you things in their RFQ or RFI, basic stuff like what your billings are, how many clients you have, how many of those clients you've won or lost over the last few years. They're asking you these questions in order to assess how healthy your company is. They don't want to hire an agency that's going to go out of business in 6 months. So how do you stay healthy? Well, one is to grow your existing clients, of course. The other way is attracting new clients. And how do you do that? You do that by demonstrating you've solved similar problems before. So if a client is preventing you from showing your work to other prospects, it's actually undermining their own investment. They're making you less strong as an agency. They're cutting their nose off to spite their face. The other thing I do here with the client is I ask them why. And why is this important to them? Maybe they just simply don't want to share a valuable resource with a competitor, or, usually there's some sort of conflict clause in these types of contracts. Maybe they simply don't want to share you with anyone, which is unrealistic. Or maybe they're worried that a case study will reveal a kernel of proprietary information that will be an unfortunate thing for them. But once I understand what the real concern is, then it's much easier to present a compromise that's going to work for both of us. And again, sorry, Sharon, I didn't mean to cut you off, but don't assume that this is an issue that you can bring up easily later when the work is done. Remember, you're in your strongest negotiating position right now. And the other thing that this also goes for is securing future client references as well. So another familiar scenario for many of you is that that rush, that scramble to secure client references for your proposal or your pitch document, or that awful feeling of waiting for a client to call you back or send you back an email to say yes. You're essentially waiting to hit send with that proposal until that client can say yes or no whether using their name. So get that agreed to upfront as well. Even if it's conceptually, even if it's managing their expectations to say, if you meet certain benchmarks, if the relationship is good, the expectation is you will be using their name and their information as a reference. They're probably going to be much more amenable to that, and they won't have to sort of equivocate over it later. Yeah.
Well, and I think it's important. Jody's done a great job laying out the business consequences and why a potential piece of business might be less valuable to you if you cannot use examples of work or client identities. But what I'd like to leave you with is an understanding that the ability to display, remember that in the course of negotiating your contract, it's highly likely you're going to be addressing the issue of work for hire. And my plug there is, never agree to a work for hire provision that kicks in before you're paid. So no money, no rights transfer. But further to that point, remember that the ability to display samples of work on your website and your creative portfolio and in your proposals, and the ability for some of your individual creative team members to display examples of work in their portfolios, which you should be controlling as an agency, by the way. These are intellectual property rights. And to the extent that you're carving out a license, which is the legal term for a portfolio or a display right, to show this work, it's got to be memorialized in writing. Remember, I indicated to you earlier that IP rights transfer only in a written instrument or document. So if you're transferring work because it's a work for hire, but then you want the ability to later display it or use it, you want to make sure that you've carved that out as a license. And in most cases, you won't actually use the term license, but you're going to want to make sure you address it in writing in the agreement. Because in as much as it's a competitive necessity for you, it's also a legal requirement that you've got something in writing reflecting it.
So finally,
rounding home.
rounding up. That we tend to have a lack of consistent legal tools in place within your new business process. Going forward, our advice to you is make this process as frictionless as possible by having consistent legal documents you can use in every pitch. That way you're going to be ready when that prospect or search consultant calls, and you're going to eliminate the need to scramble around and repurpose documents that you wrote for other clients, or even worse, repurpose documents that were written by other clients. You'll avoid having to track down your CEO or your CFO or even your outside counsel, which is going to save you both time and money. Sorry, Sharon.
No, I totally, and I completely endorse that approach, and I'd be willing to bet good money on the fact that almost every agency represented on the call today has had the following scenario occur. Okay, we got a new project, we got a new client, we got a new piece of business, we're all excited. We need the contracts done like yesterday because they want us to start right away. We got to hit the ground running. So your account director, whatever title you're using for them right now, your new business person, worked at 2 agencies before he or she came to work at your agency. They've got an awesome library of templates that they've cobbled together from every client they've worked with or agency whose employee they've been, and it's all mashed up into one big document that in some cases is a hot mess. Doesn't make sense, uses different tenses and speaks in different voices, and has legal provisions that just don't make any sense. Avoid all this. In addition to Jody's suggestion that you have a consistent set of legal documents, things like a model master services agreement, things like a model set of short form legal terms and conditions for those smaller projects or those engagements that are going to be lower dollar, lower value to you, and that you need to document quickly. Have a short form set of legal terms that you can put in your proposal or your statement of work. In addition to all of that, you want to make sure that you've got a consistent way of handling the process in a centralized manner within your agency. And what do I mean by that? Just like you've got one person or a small team of people out there in charge of new business for your agency, you should only be having one or a very small handful of individuals responsible for memorializing your client relationships and contracts. I really am averse to the system of letting every account director handle the contracts with their own team's clients. Because what ends up happening is the agency has completely inconsistent agreements and approaches across multiple clients. Sometimes there are good reasons to have inconsistent agreements, and sometimes you don't have a choice if you're signing the client's contract. But to the extent that you can control this, and you have more control than you think, not only do you want consistent tools, but you want a centralized process within your agency. So the same person or people handling, signing off on, reviewing. And the more that person does this, the faster they're going to be at it as well, which also saves you time and money. It also helps you with benchmarking. I mentioned this briefly earlier, but it's much quicker and more streamlined to benchmark a professional services agreement that a brand provides you if you have your own contract to measure it against. Use it, if nothing else, as a checklist for making sure the agency is protected in the areas that it cares about. Similarly, use your own model non-disclosure agreement as a benchmark for reviewing an NDA that a client might propose to you. Having your own tools makes things faster, makes things cheaper, and makes you better educated about how to negotiate from the client's perspective and off their templates. So we talked about common mistakes earlier, and just to reiterate, we've created here a checklist of solutions, fixes for some of these things, and we'll obviously make these available to you. But in summary, I'm going to kick it over to Jody to get us started with reviewing some of these solutions.
Have a standard NDA in place. Make it straightforward, make it mutual, and don't be afraid to use it. Number 2, make sure you're giving away, if you're giving away spec work or ideation, that it's your choice and you're clear with your client and your prospective client what they're going to own and what you're going to retain ownership of. Number 3, define your scope of work and compensation clearly. Learn how to make your intangible product something tangible that can be valued.
I think we spent a lot of energy around this, but it's worth reiterating because, Jody wanted you to walk away with at least one takeaway, and this would be my takeaway. Please don't start work without signed paperwork. It's just a recipe for lots of things, both on the business and the legal side, to go wrong. Also, make sure you're taking the time up front to think about, negotiate, and document what kind of work display rights you're going to have, because it'll impact your ability to do business development going forward. And then finally, as you just indicated, have your model legal toolkit ready to go so that you can quickly get to the point of doing what you love to do, which is the work and working with the clients, not taking care of some of the legal stuff that you have to deal with. We're going to kick it over to Bob to see if any questions have come in. And while we do that, I'm going to leave our contact information up here. Jody and I both welcome you reaching out to us individually if you have any questions about what we've talked about today or about contract negotiation in general.
And we are getting a lot of questions. So just a heads up, we'll probably go past a couple minutes past 2 o'clock, but I do want to get some questions in since people are continuing to send in questions. Questions about intellectual property, master services agreements, non-disclosure agreements. So let's go to the questions. Here's one about IP rights. How do we know when it's appropriate to agree to work for hire language versus keeping our copyrights and just giving the client a license or right to use?
That sounds like a Sharon question.
Yeah, I think that there's a couple things to keep in mind. It's a minority approach, I will say. I know that agencies that are more design or creative centric tend to take a firmer line on retention of ownership of their assets and really giving clients just a right to use or a license. I would say that it's most usually the client's expectation that they are going to own the work rights in the end, and that's usually appropriate for you to agree to only after you've been paid in full. But there are some situations where I think it might make sense in certain business models for the agency to retain the rights and only give clients a license or permission to use. That's in situations where the agency is particularly strong in a vertical or a category, and they assist many clients in an industry in non-competing markets by helping them implement and execute similar programs or similar creative concepts. If that sounds like your business model, you're helping a lot of non-competing businesses in the same industry in different markets, but you're using similar creative concepts and ideas, you're going to want to hold on to that IP and just give a license. I would also say that if your work is heavily...
Whoops.
Hello. And it
looks like Sharon got kicked off.
Okay, so let's continue with the questions with you, Jody.
I was going to say, hopefully one that I can answer.
Okay, yes, we do. There are several questions. You talked about using selection criteria to determine the risk-reward ratio of pitching a piece of business. Can you give an example of that?
Sure. Yes. So, again, selection criteria should be more than something like, revenue threshold is important, but sometimes I see qualitative things like, the clients have to be nice or must pay on time, which of course you don't really know until you've actually started working with a client and you learn the hard way. So here's an example of how this might work. Let's create a scenario. Let's say this prospective client is a B2C marketer. I don't know, let's say they're in the personal care products and services business, and that happens to be a category that you want to get into. They promise to provide $2 million of revenue, and that works within your goals. And they also are interested in having you do, again, let's say you're a social media agency and you want to start specializing more in social listening or social care. So you start to see all those boxes get checked. Now, contrary to that, maybe you're an agency that for a long time has been known to do B2B work. And so what would your reaction be if it were a B2B client in the financial services industry that wants you to do something that you're not that interested in doing? So all of a sudden that risk reward, the first example, the risks may be high, new type of client, category you're not familiar with, but the rewards are potentially going to be high as well, because you're going to start doing work that you want to grow expertise in. You're going to start doing work in a category you want to be known for. So that's sort of an example of where you start to balance how those selection criteria apply to those risks and rewards of pitching.
Okay, a question on scope of work. We're definitely guilty of describing our scopes of work in vague terms. Any advice on how to fix that?
Sure, yes. Well, first of all, it's a little bit, I can give you some initial advice. It's one of those things that's definitely hard to fix on the phone in a webinar like this, and especially in a couple of minutes. So I would encourage you, if that's something that you're struggling with, to shoot me an email or give me a call. We can talk about it in more depth. But here are a couple of ways you can sort of switch your mindset or switch your approach. Number one, start thinking more from the perspective of the client rather than from this perspective of your agency. I find a lot of the descriptions of scope or description of work process is so self-referential, and taking a step back and trying to strip away a lot of the unnecessary stuff and get down to what's really most important to the client is very valuable. Number two, don't take the obvious stuff for granted. So I think sometimes what we do, we treat it like, well, it's just what we do. Why is it special? Of course, we're going to do research when we start to immerse ourselves, when we get into the initial ramp up. But there's a lot of stuff that you do there that does have value. So it may seem obvious to you that you spend a certain number of hours researching certain types of sources, but you probably have a methodology that brings back really quality research. So think a little bit about what's there, what's obvious to you, but actually could have real value to the client, especially if you're in the process of getting to them to approve that work. And then
I'm back, guys. Sorry about that.
Oh, hey.
Computer crashed.
And then the third thing I was just going to say is resist jargon. If you find yourself starting to use those words that are meaningless, empty adjectives like rigorous and relentless, take a step back and see if you can edit that out and make it a little more tangible.
Okay, a question just came in on master services agreements. Do we need a full MSA for every client and for every project? Is there a shorter or less formal way to document client relationships for smaller projects?
I know that Jody is a fan of, and I endorse this as well, of if you need something in a pinch, using a letter of agreement. Ultimately, as long as both parties sign it and it has the necessary terms in it, it's a contract. I don't care what you call it. So for those shorter form engagements, or for those things that you need to document in a hurry, doing either a short form set of legal terms and conditions and including those in your proposal, your statement of work, or doing a letter of agreement that has all the necessary terms in it, will get you there in a hurry. And I'd say the lower the risk, the more comfortable I am with you using some of those alternate tools. The bigger the project, the bigger the dollars, the more likely it is that you should wait to get the MSA executed.
Okay. My computer's telling me it's 2:07.
Yeah.
Jody, thank you. Sharon, thank you. Lots of great takeaways, insights. Just a reminder, everyone will be getting a PDF of today's presentation. We thank everyone for tuning in. Our next webinar, June 6th, on digital project management. With that, again, Sharon, Jody, thank you. We thank everyone for tuning in. And with that, have a great day, everybody. Goodbye.
Thanks, Bob. Thanks, everyone.
Thanks, everybody.